So today we talk about pricing strategies for your SaaS. Patrick, thank you so much for taking the time to share your experience. We've been getting lots of questions. So I'm really excited to talk to you about this. What's interesting is that pricing, it touches on so many areas of SaaS product, right? It's not just how much you charge for your product. It also identified perceived value or lack of value in your product. I interviewed Thomas Smale a while ago, the founder of FA International, and he said that the easiest way to increase your revenue is actually increase your pricing. And he says that that's what majority of companies that are buying other companies doing. So pricing is like definitely a big part of revenue or SaaS. But also there's an issue of at what point can we say that, we started losing maybe some clients to pricing. So there are too many questions, not enough time. I don't want to lose a minute. Can you share with us high-level overview what it is that we're going to talk about today?
Yeah, totally. We're going to walk through a little bit of a framework of how to think about pricing, which I think is one of the most important things to do. Because I think a lot of people, they think, oh, it's just the number on the page. It's just how much you're actually charging. And in reality, there's a lot of different levers that you can pull with your pricing.
Awesome. Let's get the ball rolling.
I want to give you a framework for how to understand and ultimately optimize your monetization. And what I mean by that is, again, like how can I basically help you look at this as a growth lever within your business rather than just something you do, once every, couple years or something like that. And so who am I to talk about this? So my background's in econometrics and math. I started my career working in US intelligence and then at Google. And then I started a company called ProfitWell about 8 years ago. We have a bunch of different tools. I'm not going to go into any of them. Except for we are sitting on a ton of data. We have about 20,000 companies using our free subscription financial metrics product. So it plugs into Stripe, Zora, Braintree, Recurly, whatever you're using, and gives you all of the reporting you need. And then we make money through a bunch of other fun products, one of which is particularly focused on pricing. So the big TLDR here, again, is not to sell you. That was a terrible sales pitch, but to kind of show you that since we have so many companies using the product, we're sitting on so much data, we can understand, what works and what doesn't in the world of SaaS, and then, expand it into the world of subscriptions as well. So when we set the stage here of what we're actually trying to do with monetization, I want you to think about either your business or the business that you're looking to start. You've created some sort of value. And because we don't trade, goats for wheat anymore, what basically happens is you're ascribing that value to a dollar amount or whatever your currency in particular is. And so the way I want you to think about your pricing and your monetization in general is that your pricing is the exchange rate on the value that you're creating. So if we go one step deeper, then we start to realize that everything that we're doing from our sales and our marketing all the way to our finance team and our operations and our product teams is used to drive someone to a point of conversion or to justify the product or the price that they're offering. And so when we start to realize this, there's a bunch of different levers, right? There's the actual people we sell to. You might be selling to someone who doesn't have any money for what you're offering, or maybe they don't value the thing that you're offering. This is why a lot of companies will go up market or down market because they're trying to find that market that really fits towards their product. You can obviously adjust the product, not only in terms of features that you can ship, but there's also things where you can pull features out and make them add-ons or differentiate them in a more proper manner. And then ultimately there is the price, which is not only something that will impact conversion, but it also impacts the perception of your particular product. Because if you're a more premium product, you should be price premium. There's nothing worse, and this happens all the time in the world of SaaS, where your price is basically so cheap, people are starting to question the quality of it. And so what's the number that we look at if we go even one layer deeper? Well, to know if you're really taking advantage of monetization, you want to look at your ARPU, your average revenue per user. Now, you might measure this in a couple of different ways, ACV or ARPA, but once you start measuring it and looking at this framework, you start to realize, hey, there's a bunch of easy things that we can do. We can adjust how much of our product we give away for a particular price point. We obviously, as Thomas said, can increase our prices. There's an add-on strategy, which is one of the most underutilized pieces of the world of pricing and SaaS out there. And then, of course, there's a bunch of harder things, and these are not exhaustive, but going up market is actually harder today than it was 10 years ago, and so is feature differentiation, just because there's so many features out there. And so ARPU is the really, really big thing. And for the sake of time, the one data point I want to show you here is that it takes a lot of time, not because it's actually hard, but because people kind of get in their own way to actually adjust their pricing. It's actually about 3 years. Now, what's interesting is that younger companies tend to update their pricing more quickly because they're not as old school in terms of not knowing that this is a growth lever. But what we've consistently found is that those folks who make more pricing changes, and this does not mean just raising their price. This means adding different add-ons, adjusting their discounts, changing up their customer profiles, these types of things. They tend to have those higher ARPU. So this line here, these are companies that change their price every quarter. This line down here are those who change it every 3 years. And so again, if you measure something and you focus on it, you tend to improve it or change it. Now, why is this so important right now? We've lost a lot of our power as businesses. It was one of those things where over the past 20-ish years, we were basically getting the ability to ship product quicker. And to the point that all of us, if we want to start a brand new company by the end of the day, we could spin up a server, spin up a website, and everything would be great. The other thing that was amazing is we were getting all these brand new marketing channels really, really quickly. So we had Google AdWords for a penny a click. Then we had remarketing, Google Display Network, Yahoo Display Network, all of these different pieces. So if you're building a company from 2000 to 2012, 2015 or so, things were amazing. But now, unfortunately, what's happened is we haven't had a new marketing channel since 2015. And we're all reaching a point where we're shipping not necessarily as fast as one another, but we're shipping relatively close together. So there's so many competitors out there, even if they're not direct competitors. So your customer acquisition costs are up about 70% over the past 6-7 years. I'll share this data afterward. Your product value, just the perceived value of your product according to customers, is down by about 60 to 80% over the past 5-6 years. And customers are more unhappy than ever. It's not because they're unhappy, but it's just because software isn't as magical as it once was. And these are NPS scores over kind of a 6-year period. And so the big thing I kind of want to leave you with is when you really think about what's happened in the market, you used to be able to just spend money like it's 2005. You used to be able to just spend money. You just used to be able to acquire customers. But what's happened in the past couple of years is that basically now you need to be good at acquisition just to survive. And where a lot of the growth is coming from, and we see this consistently in the data, are from those companies who have more of a balanced growth approach, which means they're still spending half their budget on sales, marketing, et cetera. But in addition to that, they're spending more than, the 30 hours a year on pricing and things like retention. We're going to talk about what we can actually do. So I'm going to talk about this because I don't know all the stages of everyone on the call. I'm going to talk about this in a very phased approach. And we're going to start with getting your stuff together. So these are the two foundational things if you're a SaaS company that I believe that you need to focus on. And if you are an advanced company and you haven't done these things, you need to do them very, very quickly. If you're just really early stage, these are the two things to worry about when you're getting your pricing strategy, moving forward initially. So the first one is, and this is the thing that if you get everything else wrong, but you get this right or even somewhat right, you'll be okay. And what that is charging based off of a value metric. Now, a value metric, it's what you charge for. For someone like Intercom, it's based off the number of people that flow through the messaging product. One of their competitors, Drift, very, very similar company, but they charge based on seats. Wanted to show an example where you could see two very competitive companies doing very different value metrics. And the reason for this is because Drift predominantly targets sales folks, whereas Intercom predominantly targets, sales, products, support, and a bunch of other different types of personas. Now, the reason that this is so important is that if you remember back to your economics class, either in high school or in college, you probably realized or were told that essentially there's all these little points on a demand curve that you can go after, and that would be your particular price point. Well, with a value metric, you get price points for every type of buyer because they're entering based on their actual usage. So if it's a company that only needs 2 seats, you can sell to them. If it's a company that needs 1,000 seats, you can sell to them, and you make sure you're not charging them the same amount of money. Just to show you kind of how this works out in terms of numbers. So this is growth based on the pricing model. So the light green are those folks who are pure value metric companies. And these are folks who, don't have feature differentiation. And then the dark green are those folks who have feature differentiation as their primary pricing. And the reason this growth actually exists is because churn is really, really good. If I'm not using as much of the product, I end up paying less, and presumably I might downgrade, but it's one of those things where I'm not necessarily going to churn. And if I've connected this with a freemium offer, all of a sudden I have this huge spectrum of users that can essentially come in and use the product how they'd like. Here's some data basically just showing that churn is much, much lower for those folks who use value metrics versus those who don't. And of course, the other side of the equation here is expansion revenue is really, really high. Your users are going to use your product at different levels. You want to make sure that those folks who are using more of your product are getting more value. It doesn't necessarily have to be a perfect measure of usage, are essentially the ones who are, paying for it. And you can see here that essentially the value metric folks, as they use more, as they get more of the value metric, they tend to expand their revenue. And it's also a really good relationship with your customers because you're essentially saying you're only going to pay for the value you get, assuming that they buy into the value. Think of what is the perfect value for your product, even if you can't measure it. So maybe it's the amount of time, the amount of joy you bring them. I know that sounds fluffy, but think of the actual pure value metric for them. It might be in B2B, it's typically cost you save them, revenue you bring them, efficiency you bring them. And if you can measure it and your customer agrees with your measurement of the value metric, then that should be your value metric. Now, if you can't measure it, and sometimes it's hard, HubSpot at the end of the day, it's the amount of revenue they bring you through marketing activities. But oftentimes what ends up happening is you can't measure that revenue perfectly. So then what you need to do is you need to take a step back and find a proxy. So for HubSpot, it's things like contacts, number of visits, not even users. It's basically those contacts. But that's kind of how you find it. It's find the ideal one. And then if you can measure it, great. If not, take one step back. And then you should test this amongst your users by doing some research. The next big piece for your early days, but you probably have done only 5% of the actual work to make sure you're determining your market. And the reason is that if we go back to our mental model here, our framework, and we think about, hey, we're driving people to these point of conversions, or we're justifying the product or the price for that persona. If you do not know who these people are, or at least the segments that you should be targeting, it is nearly impossible to set up proper pricing, let alone a good funnel or a flywheel, depending on who you ask these days, let alone the product, etc. And so the really, really big thing is not just to have little personas that, Grandpa HubSpot and Grandma Marketo have been talking about for a decade or so, but to really, really focus on quantifying these folks. And so here's just kind of an example. So if our CPO comes to me and says, hey, I want to work on, something like, the design, of the site. What I'll say is, listen, I understand design's important, obviously, but right now the higher value things that we need to go after, since we're targeting Meredith here, are things like accuracy and uptime and reliability. And in the nature of building a company, you are resource constrained, and that's an understatement. So you want to make sure that you're focused on who you're going after. Now, ultimately, you want to validate these folks, and that uses kind of a bastardized version of the scientific method here. So you want to make sure you're collecting a bunch of fun data, running it through some statistical models. And the reason this is also super important is that when we were building ProfitWell, which was our second product, we started off actually with the pricing product. We realized after doing this research that this is what our unit economics looks like for two of the personas that we were going to go after. And I'm sure a lot of you have caught up ahead where basically Startup Steve, we were making no money, and Mid-Enterprise Meredith, we were going to be underwater. And so for a bootstrap company that doesn't have a lot of money to just kind of throw stuff up against the wall, this was really, really important to realize because we didn't waste 18 months trying to figure out, oh, wait, these customers just aren't great. We knew this really early on in our dev cycle, and we were able to act. And this is what led, and I can talk about this more in the Q&A, this is what led to basically using the freemium model for our metrics product. And we were between that, killing the product or going up market, and going up market in the analytics space costs a lot of money. So it led to basically the freemium product, which also is not cheap, but there's a much wider strategy here to keep in mind. When you've kind of figured out these two pieces, here are some other bigger topics that you have to think about. First one is price localization. Price localization is basically making sure that you are pricing based on the currency of the customer you're going after, as well as the demand of the customer you're going after. And the reason that this is so powerful is because even if you just cosmetically update your prices, so this is the cosmetic localization, this is the control, no localization, you're going to see a lift in your overall average revenue per user because you're going to get more people to purchase. It's just something innate. We want to trust the currency we normally pay in. Sometimes banks, will have restrictions if we're not paying in the currency that we're going to pay in. It's something that cosmetically it works really well. Now, more advanced, you're actually going to update your pricing based on the density of the region. And you're going to make sure the price is effectively different in the United States versus the UK versus Western Europe, maybe versus Eastern Europe, and so on and so forth. And the reason for this, just to show you just differences in willingness to pay. This is all willingness to pay relative to the United States. We're based in the United States, so sorry, that's a little ethnocentric, I'm sure. But it's one of those things where, the UK relative to the US, and this is 1.5 million different data points on willingness to pay. So there's a lot of different products in here. Your product probably is going to have different variants than what you're seeing. But in the UK, about 15, 20% higher. Western Europe, 20% higher. Nordics are always willing to pay the most. I think it's just because of the standard and cost of living there. And then down here, obviously Southeast Asia and Brazil, typically less than what's happening in the US. So localize your pricing. The reason I think this is a really good starter project is because if you think about what you'd have to do to localize, you have to get your billing system in order, these types of things. The next point, a committee. And this really comes down to making sure that you have a pricing process. And what I mean by that is making sure that even if it's just you and a co-founder, you have a date on the calendar, a recurring meeting that's maybe once a month, once a quarter, once every 6 months, just to revisit the pricing. The reason for this is because what ends up happening is that there's no one team that necessarily owns this or owns it in its entirety. With pricing, it touches multiple teams, marketing, product, sales, finance, a bunch of other teams depending on the size of your company as well. And so what we really, really recommend doing is make sure you have the right people in the room and make sure they're meeting somewhat regularly. You should be changing something about your pricing every quarter. This is not saying increase your price every quarter. What I'm saying is you should be making an adjustment very similar to you make adjustments in your sales, your marketing process. You should be making adjustments to your monetization process as well. Because if your product and your brand, all these things are improving, your pricing should improve as well. Now, traditionally, who should be in charge and who should be the main decision maker? Typically the leader of marketing or the leader of product. Sales, the incentives just aren't necessarily aligned, and finance is really good at Excel engineering pricing, but the inputs might not be great. There's always exceptions to that statement, but it's one of those things to kind of think about. A couple more points here. So establishing a customer research cycle. I talked about this a little bit in the beginning. A lot of us are building the wrong product. So I'm going to display this. I'm going to double dip here, not only give you data that supports this point, but also give you another really good framework for understanding value and pricing of your product. So it's a nice little classic 2x2, and we'll talk about a cup of coffee here. So if I'm trying to determine the monetization path for a cup of coffee, there's typically two axes of willingness to pay or value. The first axis is the features. So what is the relative value of these different features? Do the customers I'm targeting care about taste? Do they care about country of origin? Do they care about temperature? What does that actually look like? And then the other axis is what does willingness to pay look like? And so what I can do is using some methodologies that are open source, you can make them more complicated. Our software, we made these much more complicated, but you don't need to use our software, is I can ask a segment. I can ask whoever's listening to this. I can ask a segment of Salt Lake City where I am, a segment of Boston where our headquarters is, or even a segment of Rosario where our other office is. And I can find out that overall, compared to all the other features, the most important feature is relative to the others. People are pretty indifferent about temperature, and the least favored relative to the other features is country of origin. It doesn't mean that country of origin isn't a very preferred feature for someone. It just means in the aggregate, compared to these other features, this one is the least valuable. Now, using another methodology you can use open source, you can make it more complicated. There's software you can buy as well. I can find out that those people whose number one features, they're willing to pay about 25% more. Those people whose number one feature is temperature, they're willing to pay about 20% less. And those people who, country of origin, the hipsters in the audience here, who really care about where their coffee comes from, they're willing to pay about 35% more. So the framework is, if I find a feature, a value proposition, an aspect of the product that in aggregate for that segment is highly valued, and the people who care about it as their number one are willing to pay more for it, that's a differentiable feature. Low value relative to everyone else, but the people who really care about it are willing to pay more. That's an add-on. High value relative to everyone else, and the people who really care about it aren't willing to pay more. This is typically a core feature. And then we don't talk about this with our customers, but in marketing, we'll say it's trash, right? Now you're going to have to build some trash. Don't get me wrong. Like mobile apps in certain spaces, like fleet management and things like that, it shows up in trash. The login screen would show up in trash. These are just things that are just like so table stakes, and you're not going to get any credit for building them. So we went out to about 1,300 product leaders, and we asked them, for your last N features, where would you put them in these 4 boxes? And this is what they said for just under 5,000 features. So there's a lot of confidence. Obviously, they're building these features, so there is a lot of confidence. There's some insecurity down here, of course, as well. But we then went out and asked about 1.2 million different customers of these products in a composite study using the methodologies we've developed. And again, they're kind of cousins of the open source ones that you can use. And this is what the customers said. So this is what we think we're building, and this is what we're actually building.
I love it. I love it. The framework that you shared before is, I think it just needs to give it a second to sink in for everyone to take a screenshot and think about it when they're building those features. And then those additional 2 screenshots are like really eye openers, right?
Yeah, totally. And the thing to think about, to connect the dots here, is this wasn't always this way. Because when there weren't as many features, there wasn't as much product, there weren't as many expectations, features moved very, very slowly through these quadrants. Because features move. Not all of the features will move. Your core, super core feature probably won't move. But it took about 8 to 10 years, or at least that was the velocity for features to move from one quadrant to another. We took a snapshot about 2.5 years ago now, and this is what it looks like now in terms of where features move, because they're moving much more quickly. So some features will obviously move quicker than others, but now the velocity is basically a fifth of what it once was. And so it's huge. It's huge, huge, huge. Another big thing, and this is another very, very practical thing for you, is how to raise prices. And yes, you should raise prices. 80 to 85% of the people that we talk to are typically underpriced. The problem becomes figuring out how much you're underpriced, but you're probably underpriced. And you might think, oh, that's okay, I'll just get more volume. Software doesn't work like that. Well, not all software works like that. There is a point where your price is too cheap that people are going to start questioning the quality of your product. And so a couple things to actually go after and change in terms of pricing. So first up, I'm not a really big fan of keeping people on legacy plans. I think that you should raise prices on existing customers. Now, there are some exceptions here. Obviously, your earliest and early customers, maybe you want to kind of reward them for being so beta customers with you. Also, if you have an incredibly large total addressable market, you can get away with not raising prices on existing customers. But I think it's, you're basically not using a growth lever. The other thing is physically raising prices, you probably can only do once per year. It's really hard to do it more than once per year on the same customer unless you're flying. HubSpot, prior to the IPO, they were raising prices once every 6 months. And that's because they were shipping so much and moving so quickly. Now, in terms of actually moving forward, make sure you do your research. And this goes into how much you should actually raise your prices. I'll share some resources on how you can actually do this after the call. You're going to probably want to run an impact analysis. And anyone who is basically getting a larger than a 50% increase in their price, you probably want to personalize or even give them a phone call depending on the actual magnitude of the price. If they're going from $1 to $2, don't worry about it too much. If you're going from, $500 to $1,000, it's probably worth a phone call for that individual to explain what's going on and soften the impact a little bit. Now, in terms of messaging, here's some really practical messaging. Use this as a template, but obviously adjust it for your own means. The first thing that we want to do is we want to remind them of the value. We want to pull in some actually good data that they are using. Like, hey, they're using feature B, you're using it daily. We've made you this much money. Your contacts have grown this much over the past 12 months. Actually quantify as much as humanly possible how much value you're bringing them. Then you want to remind them, or basically introduce the price increase, but you want to remind them that it's to invest in making the product better for them. Then you want to make sure that you reward them for being loyal. So because they've been with you for 4.5 years or whatever it is, we're going to give what's called a legacy discount, which means, hey, for everyone else, all these new people who weren't as loyal as you, they're going to get the new price that's increased. For you, though, you're getting your existing price for the next 6 months. And after that, we're going to bump you up to the new price. And then obviously you want to give them an out. Thanks for being or thank you for letting us be a part of your growth. If you have any questions at all, let us know. Now, the really, really nice thing to do here is also throw in this PS. If this materially impacts your business or your life if you're a D2C product, let me know and we'll work something out. This PS serves two purposes. One, if someone actually is being impacted in their business, especially this year with all the crazy stuff going on, you probably want to be nice and get a lot of brand value and basically say, not a problem at all. We'll meet in the middle discount, or we'll just let you on your legacy plan for a longer period of time. This PS is also for folks like me. And what I mean by that is I don't want to spend any more money. Mm-hmm. Like I don't want to spend more money for the thing that I'm getting. You know, I have to worry about a P&L, right? But after you've reminded me of how much value I'm getting and all of these different things, now with this PS, I look at this and go, oh no, I like the product. I'm not going to fuss about it. Like all that kind of stuff. And I don't respond, or I just kind of accept the price increase. A lot of things you can do. This legacy discount as well as this PS work really, really well. If you ever want to get a hold of me, I'm just Patrick at ProfitWell.com. We do free pricing audits. Basically, if you're hooked up to ProfitWell, we can give you some really, really cool benchmarks and things like that.